Welcome to Wildcat Science with Mrs. Haugo. This is Biology, Evolution, Part 4. In Part 3, we learned about the evidence for evolution with comparative anatomy and homologous structures, vestigial structures with human goosebumps and leg bones in whales, and the similarities of embryos. We will be learning more about molecular biology, which is the biology at the molecule level. So all organisms have a similar genetic or chemical makeup. So please write that down. All living organisms have DNA or RNA as their genetic material. So everything that is alive has DNA that carries the instructions on how to make that organism, or there are some things that have RNA that control that information, those instructions. Closely related species share a higher percentage of DNA sequences. For example, chimpanzees and humans share 98% of our DNA is the same. And so the more closely related your DNA is, the more evolutionarily close the two organisms are. So we are more evolutionarily close to chimpanzees than to bananas, because we share 98% of our DNA with a chimpanzee and less than that with a banana. Also, many organisms have the same proteins and the same enzymes. And all organisms use ATP in energy transfer. So what does this all mean? This indicates a genetic relation between all living organisms. And this indicates that these animals evolved from a common ancestor. So the building blocks of how to make a living organism, whether it's a bacteria or a human or a banana or a snake, are all very similar. All of them use DNA or RNA as their genetic material. All of them have a lot of the same proteins and enzymes. All of them use ATP to transfer energy. And this makes sense because if you have the basic building blocks of how to make a living organism and how that living organism survives, then natural selection can act on those things, but it's not going to change the building blocks. So there are things that could change. Natural selection could work on a forelimb that would evolve into like a flipper for swimming, or a wing for flying, or a leg for running, but it's not going to change those essential building blocks. There is also quite a bit of evidence for evolution in paleontology. If you notice, that's number 2, because number 1 was comparative anatomy, which had a number of structures in there, a number of subsets, homologous structures, vestigial structures, similarities of embryos, and molecular biology. And now we're moving on to a whole different category than comparative anatomy, which is paleontology, which is fossils and the study of ancient life. Fossils often show gradual changes in prehistoric and extinct species. So what do fossils tell us? Well, fossils tell us that species have changed slowly over millions of years and that species have evolved. Fossils also tell us that living species were not always on Earth, and that species that are not around today did exist in the past. So this may seem obvious, but this was not obvious 150 years ago. It was assumed that all of the animals on the Earth had always been there, and that there was nothing that had been around that was no longer around. So we can see let's say the evolution of horses and how they have changed slowly over the last, I'm not quite sure, but 50 million years. And we can also see that, well, dinosaurs were around, but they're not around anymore. So speaking of the evolution of horses, what are the fossils that show the evolution of horses over the last 50 to 60 million years? So this is Equus. This is the modern genus of horses. And we can see as we go back about 50 to 60 million years that the horses were smaller than they are now. And these are the strata in the earth where these fossils were found going back down. There have been other changes besides just the size. We can see the toe. It used to have 4 toes, more like a little bit more like a human foot, and those bones fused into just 1 toe or hoof, and then the hind foot has been the same thing, and we can see that there has been changes in teeth, probably with some changes in diet, with changes in climate. So what would these ancestors to the modern day horse have looked like? If you look down here, and about 55 million years ago, where we were talking about them having more toes, more like a human or a monkey or some other mammals. It was quite small. You can see it was about 2 feet tall. And then going up to about 30 million years ago, they're a little bit taller, maybe 2-3 feet tall. And then that 5th toe has fused with the 4th one. And then going up to about 30 to 25 million years ago, the toes have changed a little bit and it's gotten bigger, maybe 3-4 feet. And then going up to about 15 million years ago to the present day, we can see that the horses have gotten larger and that all of the toes have fused into a hoof. And then the modern day, you can see, is even bigger still, and that would be the present day size of a horse. Besides paleontology, like fossils that show us that animals that aren't around today were around in the past, and that there has been a progression of animals that were a little bit different and have changed slowly, and comparative anatomy. There's also biogeography, which is evidence for evolution. And what biogeography is, let's break this down. Living, and then geography, locations on Earth. So studying living things and where they live on Earth. So sometimes unrelated species in different parts of the world that live in similar habitats look alike. So what do we mean? Well, let's look at an example. So there's a flying squirrel in North America, and I assume you're familiar with what a flying squirrel would look like, and have many of the same characteristics of a sugar glider in Australia. So what does this tell us? Well, this indicates that the environment selected for certain favorable traits and that natural selection is at work here, and that there is an environment that is selecting for the same traits. So if you have similar environments in unrelated places like North America and Australia, then the same traits will be selected for, and there might be unrelated species that look quite similar. Let's look at pictures of a flying squirrel, which lives in North America, and a sugar glider, which lives in Australia. We can see that they both have flaps of skin that help them glide from treetop to treetop. We see that they are about the same size. We also see that they have a similarly shaped head with large ears and large eyes, and they have a large tail. One might assume that they are very closely related species because they look so similar. However, sugar gliders are marsupial animals, and we know marsupials have the pouches, and flying squirrels are placental mammals, so they are not marsupials. They're like all the other mammals that are not marsupials. So this sugar glider is more closely related to a kangaroo than this flying squirrel. Looking at a simplified view of the evolutionary history of the sugar glider versus the flying squirrel, we can see that there was a common ancestor and then it split and many of the marsupials evolved, and over here many of the placentals evolved. So a flying squirrel is more closely related to an elephant, a cat, and a human than it is a sugar glider, which is more closely related to a kangaroo, a possum, or a koala. So why do they look so similar? Well, both of these are small mammals that live only in trees, and so that is why the the flaps of skin help them jump from tree to tree. And they are also both nocturnal, which is why they both have large eyes. In both of these examples, we can see that natural selection has worked on characteristics that help the animal who lives in trees to glide from tree to tree and who is nocturnal to see better in the nighttime. So to sum it up, biogeography, which is where unrelated species, which is a study of living things and where they live on Earth, but the evidence for evolution is that unrelated species living in very different parts of the world, but living in similar habitats, will sometimes look alike, which means that natural selection is at work and the environment has selected for certain favorable traits. And we also talked about paleontology, fossil record, and what that shows about species, how they've changed over time. And we talked about comparative anatomy with the homologous structures, vestigial structures, similarities of embryos, and molecular biology. Tomorrow, we are going to be talking about the process of evolution and how that works. See you then. Bye.